express my heartfelt gratitude to Dr. Leiden and her team at the DOST for inviting me to the second National Halal Forum here in Manila. It's certainly an honor for me to be here to update you on our activities so far. Yesterday we heard a lot about harmonization. Harmonization was very much a buzzword, and we heard a lot about the issues faced currently in the Philippines halal industry, issues of fragmentation, a lot of silos, working in isolation, organizations getting involved in halal activity and not working together. Well, if you multiply those issues by 147 countries, that's the challenge that I have to face. It's quite appropriate that I should follow the previous speaker to talk about halal legislation. A lot of countries, I see this as a very positive step that the Philippines is moving forward in terms of enacting some kind of halal legislation. A lot of countries are in this dilemma where they have a strict separation of church and state and say, we're a secular government, therefore we do not want to regulate anything to do with religion, and they treat halal as a pure religious issue. But I think, as we've seen from the previous speaker, that halal is more than just a religious issue. There's impact on trade, the business, and more importantly, for consumer interests. Muslim consumers have the right to have access to halal food of which the integrity has been assured. It is certainly, being a secular government does not preclude one from having halal legislation. We've seen Australia, Singapore, and the US have got halal legislation in place. New Zealand is working on halal legislation as we speak. And I think it's a matter of finding the right legal mechanism that's already in place, that's already quite strong, and fitting halal into that existing mechanism. And I'll touch a bit more on this later. We heard a lot about how there's a lack of cohesion and a lack of a unified standard or even a single logo. Now, these may seem very familiar to you. This is really just the tip of the iceberg in terms of what halal logos are available out there. And don't get me wrong, this is not necessarily a bad thing to have multiple logos. I mean, one thing we've learned from the experience in Europe and the US is that maybe it is okay to have a lot of logos because each logo represents a different certification body, perhaps a different standard, and this is perhaps one way of accommodating the variances that exist within the Muslim world. And rather than trying to come to one single agreement, we have to accommodate these differences. And this is one way of doing it. But in order for this to be effective, the consumer must be very well informed. There must be a very heightened level of awareness and education so that the consumer is making an informed choice when they choose to buy a product with a particular logo. Just a quick snapshot of the situation of halal certification bodies worldwide. It was quite interesting to hear yesterday from Director Lirazan that there are 50 halal certification bodies in the Philippines alone. So I think I have to revise this number upwards just for that. But if we look at the sort of spread of halal certification bodies, most of it we find is actually in Australasia. And this is a random scattered diagram which I just want to illustrate a point. When we start asking questions about these certification bodies, then we get what I call a funneling effect, and the numbers kind of narrow down. We start with, let's say, 300 plus of various type of organizations, individuals that perform halal certification services. But when we ask the question, how many are actually legally registered entities, whether it's with the Register of Companies or Register of Societies, or even as an individual sole trader, then that number immediately goes down to 1/3. We ask the question again, how many are actually certifying against a recognized standard or any standard? And the number goes down even more. And how many actually have clear and transparent audit procedures that is available for everyone to see? Even less. And then there's the big question, how many are actually accredited by a competent accreditation body? Now I'll expand a bit more about accreditation because I noticed that the term accreditation and certification gets interchanged quite a bit. So this really is the backdrop to the big issue that was raised and is always raised at various halal conferences, seminars, is this need for a unified halal standard. And what we find is that halal certification is, I call it a cowboy town, because it is very unregulated, and everyone seems to be able to perform halal certification, and it is a very fragmented kind of industry. And in looking at, and one of the big issues that I learned here especially is this recognition of the halal certification. This is the big issue now. If you look at the importing authorities of some key Muslim countries like Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Gulf, each one has a list, whether it be JAKIM or MUI, has a list of what they call approved halal certification bodies, whether it's from Europe, US, Australia, New Zealand. And if you try to superimpose the various lists, the three lists, you'll find that there's very little overlap. There's actually maybe about 10 or 12. So even between Malaysia and Indonesia, which you could say is two of the most similar countries in terms of culture, mazhab, etc., there's only an overlap of about 20, when in fact there's about 40 plus. So the question is, why are there 20 halal certification bodies approved for Indonesia, but not for Malaysia? This is a question that needs to be answered. So in this drive for halal, an international halal standard, we're certainly not the first to try this. There has been other efforts. One would imagine that the ISO would be the most obvious choice for an international standard. After all, that is the bread and butter of what they do. But they have categorically said that they would not touch on any standard to do with religion. And to be honest, I don't blame them. In fact, maybe perhaps they shouldn't. Codex has actually defined the use of the term halal. There was very much a lot of input from the Malaysian government on this. But the weakness of the Codex guideline is that it stays clear of the most contentious issues. The favorite topics of debate, which is to do with stunning, mechanical slaughter, and gelatin. The World Halal Council has been formed for 10 years now. I believe they just concluded their AGM. And the only issue here is that only one OIC country is a member of World Halal Council. COMSEC is a committee for commercial and economic cooperation under the OIC, led by Turkey, who are also developing a OIC halal standard. This was mentioned yesterday by Dr. Winai. So why IHI? Why would IHI be the most appropriate organization, if you like, to try and develop this international halal standard? First of all, we're a non-government, and we're an independent international organization. And the setup of IHI conceptually was at the first World Halal Forum, and it was the industry, it was the representation of the international stakeholders which came up with the resolution to form IHI Alliance. I think our independent status perhaps gives us the most appropriate structure, if you like, to lead in this endeavor. And just to make very clear, one, IHI Alliance is not a government body, and we're certainly not a certification body. So I think that needs to be made very clear. And sometimes we run into this confusion because a lot of certification bodies think that we're going to compete with them. We are certainly not going to do that. Through our relationship